Yep, I hear a click, so I guess we're good. Good evening. Hope everybody's enjoying, well, it's not winter yet, technically, so we don't have anything to fuss about. It's still fall, right? Well, we're going to, like Seth was saying, we're going to be in Genesis 21 through 24. I'll give you a little bit of a break tonight. Uh, there's not as, well, I'll say there's not as much going on that there has been going on so far. The story starts to kind of slow down a little bit. But what that means is the author provides us with more details. And anytime Scripture, when you see something get incredibly detailed, pay attention because there's a reason for that detail. It may not be the reason we think, but it alerts us to something the author is trying to bring to our attention. So last week, oh, sorry, I, I this is something I've never been able to do, so I'll just clue you in on a little bit of the craziness that is my brain. Um, if I walk into a room and the TV is on, I have to focus on the TV because it's the sound. It's a predominant sound. Well, that one I can't see it and there's no sound, so I'm good. But no, I'll sit in the house in absolute silence because if there's anything on, my mind can't. So I would be if you threw me into solitary, I'd love it. So just saying, if I'm ever in prison, they say threaten me with solitary. Like, okay, please. So we're just going to jump right in, and again, I've chosen certain things because this is a lot of material that we're looking at. So please do not hesitate to interrupt me if you need to, get my attention if there's something that I go past too quickly or that I just completely missed that you've noticed. And we can camp on that a little bit. So chapter 21, this follows Sodom. This follows God reiterating to Abraham that it was through Isaac that there was going to be a son born to him from Sarah, it's not going to be Ishmael. And so God just kind of reinforcing details of his promise to Abraham. And in chapter 21, we start to see a lot of these things start to come to pass, finally. We see some movement, so to speak, in the story. And so two major things in chapter 21 is that Isaac is born, but then on the other side, Ishmael is sent away. There's a conflict that we're going to investigate here between these two sons. And so, again, as before, I'm going to pull up just certain verses to emphasize certain things that I saw as I read through this. And I saw three, what I call theological truths in the account of the birth of Isaac and the sending away of Ishmael. And so there's these three things I want to focus on for a second. The first one is God's faithfulness to his promise. And in verses 1 and 2, it seems like it's just a description. The author's just saying, oh, the Lord visited Sarah, and Isaac is born. But look at the repetition here in certain phrases, and I see basically, as he had said, as he had promised, at the time of which God had spoken. So we see God bringing his promise to pass. But you see that repetitive, as he said, as he said, as he promised. And so that's the first thing that we see in this, that Sarah did conceive in her old age, and she had a son, and she named him Isaac. And this is the next step, so to speak, in the progression of the patriarchs. It began with Abraham, and we're going to see next week we'll deal more with Isaac by himself, of the promise being extended to Isaac and his family. Second thing is we see God's sovereign will regarding how his promise is going to be fulfilled. And this one is important to me because we've seen throughout Genesis so far man constantly bucking God and trying to do things his way, and God interrupting man's plans and saying, no, this is going to come to pass the way I said it would. And so I emphasized here, this is because of the conflict. We know after Isaac is born, and then it talks about how Isaac, at the time of his weaning, takes place. And so this is just a stage in his development that they would celebrate. And during this celebration, there's some sort of interaction between Ishmael and Isaac that Sarah does not like. She sees something and she doesn't like it. And she demands that Abraham send Ishmael and Hagar away. Now remember, the last time this happened, God intervened and brought Hagar and Ishmael back, told them, go back and submit yourself. This time, however, we see God take a different track. And so in verse 12, we see that God basically here agrees, saying, yes, Abraham, you should send Hagar and Ishmael away. And the reason, he doesn't really give a specific reason, but you can kind of see it in the part I have highlighted here, is God reiterates to Abraham, as he's done before, it's through Isaac that your offspring will be named. In other words, it's through Isaac. Isaac is the son of promise. Isaac was my original intent, Abraham. You're the one that brought in the wild card with Ishmael. It's not his fault. It's not Hagar's fault. But they are still not part of the plan. And so that God's sovereign will, in other words, we can sometimes try to jump ahead of God and say, oh, this is how this needs to be done, and God may stop us in our tracks. It's like, well, God, you said. He says, yes, I did. But I'm the one that's going to bring this to pass, and it's going to come to pass the way that I determine it. We'll see later on, if you go into the New Testament, much of what Jesus was running up against with the Pharisees and with the Jewish people was they had figured out this is how God's going to do this. To the point that they rejected their own Messiah because the Messiah didn't fit their description. So that's an extreme of it, but we're seeing a hint of it here where Abraham meant well, but he didn't follow through with the way that God intended it to be. And so God's just reiterating here. And guess what I have a whole chunk of that in here. So you're reading my mind again. But yeah, Galatians, Paul. No, like you read my note. But no, that's Paul does. He pulls this very instance in and uses it, and we'll visit that here in just a second. So and you'll have more when we get. Yes, sir. I think there's just a potential for conflict. It was unnecessary, but also, and this is you have to bear with me on this one, there are certain things, much of what happened or what was permitted to happen in the Old Testament so that, and Paul addresses this, that it was so that we would have examples and types of things that we could pull into our present day and say, oh, there was a shadow of it here. We can see in Ishmael and Isaac in this controversy, and Paul saw it and locked onto it. Here's a perfect example. And then Paul talks about all these things happened as examples for us, so that we wouldn't do the same mistakes. And so I think there's a lot of, in God's economy, where he doesn't make it happen so, but he permits much of this, and then it's used as what we call types later on, or examples, or images, like David being an image of Messiah, and different things. And the authors of Scripture, being moved by the Holy Spirit, are going to emphasize those things. And then we, reading Scripture with the Holy Spirit guiding us, he's drawing us to those things, and we start seeing those analogies and seeing those patterns and those types. And so that's how I tend to view a lot of that. There's as much information in what we're not told sometimes, where when God remains silent on specifically what was Ishmael saying, what was he doing, it just has this word of, it was a laughing or a mocking. And Paul later on calls it, we'll see it in a minute, the word he uses for it, which means that he saw the same thing when he would. So we have God's honoring his promise. We have God's sovereign will, meaning his promise will be accomplished the way he determines it to be accomplished. But then, just to answer, I know what the question that is in our minds, or is in my mind when I read this, or when I do read this, is, what about Ishmael? He didn't do anything. He's kind of a innocent sort of victim here in a way. And so we see God's mercy. Because remember, we know what happened. Abraham sends them away. And Hagar kind of just gives up. She just goes out in the wilderness, plops down and says, I guess we'll just die here. And it's kind of like, well, you could have, anyway. But we see in this scripture here that God doesn't just let them die. He goes and finds them again. Remember the first time that Hagar was sent out, God went and found her, brought her back. This time, God goes to her and he reassures her. And so, again, what I've emphasized here is that repetition. Remember in the first account, when God went and got Hagar, she named the place, the God who hears. Remember that, the God who hears me. Well, here we go again. You see that word heard. The angel comes to her and says, God heard Ishmael crying out. And the angel was sent to tell Hagar, God has heard him. I could also emphasize where he is. There's something deeper there. God hears us where we are. And let that one kind of ferment a little bit in the brain. He hears us where we're at. We don't have to ascend the mountain before God will hear us. He'll hear us in the pit. Wherever we're at, he'll hear us. Up. I like that. Up. In other words, woman, get up. Don't sit here and waller. Get up. Get the boy and take hold of him. For I will make him into a great nation. And he does. So now I see this as an example of God's mercy. Others may disagree, but I see here God did make allowances for Ishmael. And Ishmael did there was a nation that arose from Ishmael. What that nation determined to do is up to them. But God did honor him. And God had earlier told Abraham the same thing. I will make a nation out of Ishmael as well. But he is not the child of promise. And so, Paul's analogy, that's why I'm glad you brought this up, because I thought, no, I didn't waste my time here. You saw it too, so that's always good to have that. So in Galatians, Paul draws from this situation between Isaac and Ishmael, and he draws an analogy, this is the only time Paul uses this term, when he says that it can be interpreted allegorically. And so this is in Galatians 3. It's kind of a long section, but he says, for it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman, that's Hagar, and one by a free woman, Sarah. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, and that's what you brought up. That according to the flesh, in other words, according to Sarah and Abraham's attempt, good-willed attempt, but it was still outside the will of God, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now, this may be interpreted allegorically. So where is Paul at right now? He's talking to a group of people in Galatia who were seriously considering that we should adhere to the law. They were Christians, but they kept getting pulled and tugged by individuals saying, well, Jesus is fine, but you need to become Jewish and follow the Jewish law to be a true follower. And so Paul was arguing against that. And chapter 3 is awesome, the whole chapter. But this is just a small section where Paul just presents argument after argument to try to convince them that no, the time of the law is past. The purpose of the law is past. It's all been accomplished. It's no longer necessary. And so he says these women are two covenants, meaning they represent the two covenants, the old covenant and the new. One is from Mount Sinai, talking about where the law was given. Bearing children for slavery. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Galatians 3. I'm sorry, yeah. And is it? Oh, no. My bad. Sorry about that. I got excited. But Galatians 3 is awesome too. So I'm sorry about that. I messed that up. In my notes, I don't have the chapter. I just have the verses. So I was going through this and I put in the wrong one. So sorry, yeah. When you get your notes, you won't see that faux pas. I hope. Let me see. No, I have it in there too. Shoot. Oh, well. Okay. So chapter 4. Sorry about that. So one is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai. You think Paul's trying to make a point here. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem. Ouch. Jewish people duck, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at the time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. So Paul saw something in that interchange between Ishmael and Isaac that was negative. It wasn't just laughing together as children would do. But what does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So brothers, we are not children of the slave, but children of the free woman. So why bring this up? I think Paul emphasizes something important, is from a theological standpoint, and this I might be treading on some of your beliefs here, but our present day concern for Israel should be that they recognize and receive their Messiah. That's what our concern should be. Amen. We can't get distracted, because what they need is what every nation needs. It started with Abraham. Abraham is the blessed nation. They became the blessed nation. Once Messiah came, they have the onus was the same on them as on all nations. Receive and accept, or reject and be condemned. And that's what Paul's saying. He's talking to people who are saying, those Jewish people that are trying to bind you to slavery, cast them out. God himself will cast them out. And so that's the seriousness of where Israel is right now. They've got to accept their Messiah, just like we had to. We had them accept. There's only one Messiah. There is not a separate Jewish and Christian Messiah. There is not a separate Jewish and Christian dispensation of grace. There's only one. There exists only one dispensation of grace accomplished through the one Messiah, Jesus Christ, who is revealed in the New Testament as the only begotten Son of God. So that's just, I'll leave that alone. I can discuss it with you later, but that's what I see. It started all the way back with Abraham. Yeah. Yeah, the city.
So
Yeah.
you see Paul even playing on that.
It's a,
That's a lot of
it's a neat,
taking
yeah. Yeah, and that was Paul. I mean, and for Paul to arrive at this is miraculous because, I mean, he was, like he said, he was the Jews' Jew. He says that himself. Says, I was more zealous than all of my brethren for the law. And so whatever Jesus did when he knocked him off the horse, that was pretty amazing. So let's move, sorry. Let's go to chapter 22. Unless there's something else, anything else from 21 you guys want to.
When I was reading it,
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting how Sarah handled her feelings about Hagar and Ishmael, because in like chapter 16 or whatever, she was very mean to the point that she made Hagar run away.
Mm-hmm.
And this time, she just went straight to Abraham.
Right. Yeah, you see a progression there. Yeah, that's good. That Sarah's methodology changed. As mom, she's Mama Bear. But originally she would have probably just went off on Hagar, but this time she goes to Abraham, which is significant. Thank you. Chapter 22 moves from this. Now this is significant. Don't forget where we just were. What did God tell Abraham to do? Send Ishmael away. Right? Keep that in mind. Tuck that behind your ear. God told Abraham to do that. Then, the next chapter, we have the test. It even says that. And God tested Abraham. Most everybody knows the generality of this story. What did he tell Abraham to do? Yeah, take Isaac and sacrifice him to me. What does Abraham do? Load up the donkeys, let's go. The man just amazes me. Yeah, this is not. Let me just say that this is not a model for parenting here. But no, God is not going to do this to you. If he comes to you, you might want to check for ID. That's what I was always. I told the children, I said, if God had come to me with something like this, I would have been checking for ID, because that doesn't sound like now. But something to keep in mind with as we work through this is Abraham. This was then. Abraham had no Bible. He did not have the law. He had nothing but these interactions with God and God's angels that we've been reading about. That's what he had. So we've got to hang on to that. And so if God comes to him and says, "Yo, Abraham, got a job for you." We don't know what was going on in Abraham's head. We can play around with that for years and never know. The text does not tell us. All it says is that Abram got up, gathered up the necessary stuff, gathered up Isaac, gathered up a couple servants to help him go on, and off he went. It sounds almost like God's original visit with Abram and said, "Go to a place where I will show you." Doesn't tell him where until he goes. He says the same thing here. Go and sacrifice your son Isaac on a hill that I will show you. He gives him the general region, but I'll let you know when you get there. So here I think it's important that we go back to James just for a little bit, momentarily. You'll see why. Because James talks about testing of our faith, right? That's his whole point, was right here. Count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith, that's the key. The testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And then later, James continues, and he talks about temptation. And he says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial," linking to the earlier thing about testing. "For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. So when the text says God tested Abraham, he was testing Abraham's faith. Abraham walked smack dab into one of God's tests, trials. He's been doing this his whole life, ever since God first approached Abram. Everything God has told him to do has been a test. Go. He went. You're going to have a son. Well, maybe it's with Hagar. No, you didn't. You failed. Let me go back. Take this test over again. You know, and now this is like the penultimate test of all tests. Because what has he just told Abraham about Ishmael? Send him away. Why? To prepare for this test. Now you don't have another son to fall back on. You sent him away. Sacrifice the other one to me. You know, so it really heightens this. And then when we look at the language here, this is the initial. I mean, this is just how it's written in the text, the chapter, the very first verse. Take your son. And you notice how he words this. Your only son. Interesting. So who's Ishmael? Chopped liver? He sent him away. God told him. Your only son. So in God's economy, Abram only had one son. This is just God emphasizing. Your only son. The son of promise. The one I promised you. The one I've been reiterating over and over and over and over and over again. That all of his promise is coming through him.
Doesn't that word only also, can it equally be translated as unique in Hebrew, if I'm mistaken?
Let's see.
If you're looking at your only one, it's a one of a kind.
One of a kind, yeah.
It would be like more like uniqueness to it.
But the one of a kind is a promise. The only son of promise. So that would work, yeah. It's the same, same emphasis, just taking a different angle. Yeah. Still, like, wow, Abraham, you are something else. Yeah, and he emphasizes whom you love. And but do you see, you know, we're Christians, so we can do this. All right? We have the New Testament. We can do this. It's okay. What else do you see in here? Yeah. Your only, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. You know, and then you talk about Jesus and all through the Gospel of John talking about the Father loves the Son. You know, and so you see all kinds of hints and shadows. And the Jewish people even understood this as Messiah driven. They just missed it. Overlooked that, got rid of that in favor of the conquering version of the Messiah, not realizing they're the same people. You know, they split the two. Yeah.
Isn't the land of Moriah, isn't that directly correlated to the hills right outside of Jerusalem?
Yes. There's a connection. The land of Moriah, which in the text it says, go to the land of Moriah, to the hill I will show you. And that is, yes, that's outside or within the area of Jerusalem. It's also the fuller's field that David purchased is in tradition believed to be that mountain.
So it could have literally been the same hill.
So that in the Jewish tradition, it is the temple was built upon the very hill that Abraham was preparing to sacrifice Isaac on. And so I don't see enough to reject that. You know, it has a very strong tradition to it. So the temple would have been built right smack dab on this very thing. And here later, when we get to the last little statement, you'll see it kind of keeps pointing to that, Yeah. No, he was in the southern region. Abraham kind of stayed. It would have been the area of Judah, the territory of Judah, years later, the Negev, and Hebron, Jerusalem, all of those. Do you see the threat to the promise? Again, we can't, it doesn't tell us what Abraham thought, but I can't help but think this. See what you guys think. That God has been very adamant to Abraham about, it's Isaac, it's Isaac, it's Isaac. He's the one. Now go kill him. Like, what? This is the child of promise. You keep beating me over the head with, this is the child of promise. So, at the very least, there was an existential threat to the promise present here. Abraham may not have thought this way, but the reader, I think, definitely would have noticed this and said, whoa, wait, what? How? No, this can't be. We know how it ends. So it's hard for us. We just read it and go, oh, yeah, it was just a test. But, read it as if you don't know how it ends. You're watching the movie. You don't have any idea what's going to happen. So that's where I think there was a threat when you read it that way. Well, the story, the timeline, goes really fast. Well, and there's the conversation. I think I have that up next. Yeah. And there's several verses here. So I have verse 4, verse 8, 13, 14. That's what I've got on the left. But there's a word. I don't do this a lot, but I couldn't ignore this. The words I have in red are all the same root word. It's the Hebrew word for to see something. And it's used visually, as you can see here. He lifted up his eyes and he saw the place from afar. But this word also has a range of meaning that encompasses to provide, which is why I have the two at the bottom. It's the same word root. And so what this kind of seeing is like, if you put these things together, what I see being shown here is something being revealed so that you can see it. It's hidden, and then either because you walked around the corner and you see it, that kind of provision. It's God is providing you the ability to see something, pointing it out. Like your dad used to send me out in the yard because he thought my eyes were better than his. I always had to run around the yard and look for missing bolts or stuff that came off the lawnmower or whatever. He'd send me out to look for it. And usually I'd find it. I don't know how this worked, but you'd be walking along, and you're not seeing something. You turn around and it's revealed. It was always there, but now it's revealed. And that's the sense of what's going on here. But knowing what we know as Christians, and so just look how these are being presented here. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place. So the place that God was intending, the actual mount. He saw it. It was revealed to him. God let him know that's the one. Abraham, and the second one is in the middle of the conversation because Isaac's not a dumb kid. He's seen sacrifices before, and so he's like, Dad, we have a donkey loaded, or I'm carrying the wood now, and you've got the torch. I see the knife in your belt. There's no sacrifice. There's no animal. Where's the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abram's answer, again, as Christians, this should just reverberate. God will provide. Remember that word meaning to see. God will provide for himself. So in other words, God will at some point reveal to us the sacrifice. At some point. It's like Abraham was envisioning, in his mind, well, it's you, Isaac, but maybe he didn't. Maybe Abraham already knew that God's not really going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and go through with this. God himself will reveal to me the true sacrifice he wants me to. And then we know the story. To the last second before God stops him. This would make a beautiful scene in a movie because you're like, no, whoa, no, this is just wrong. Stops him. And again, Abraham names the place. The Lord will provide, because he did. He provided an alternative sacrifice. And then this last line here, as it is said to this day, this is in Moses' day, because he's the one writing this, on the mount of the Lord, where the temple is, it will be provided. So the provision comes from the temple where God resides. All provision. That's where it's revealed. Yeah.
One thing that really stuck out to me is in verse 5, when Abraham told his servants that we will be back.
Yeah.
So he already knew.
It's either,
In his heart,
yeah.
he already knew God's going to provide.
There's a tremendous amount of hope there, or, yeah. Yeah, so there's lots of clues that I think Abraham at this point knew enough about God. And I've heard lots of theologians come up with lots of, they agree with me, but they have lots of different alternatives. And one of them was, well, he was confident, and even if he'd killed him, God could bring him back. Or
Servants might have thought it was a little weird if he said, all right, I'll be back.
I think Abraham's servants were used to seeing weird stuff at this point. I mean, they were like, yeah, this guy's, yeah. Well, I'm just going to stay right here with the donkey. Received him from the dead, yeah. So yeah, there's, it'd make a neat study, just that one little part, and just see.
Another thing you see as well is, whenever God called Abraham to Abraham, he didn't go, he said, he just moved down the river until his dad died.
Yeah, he took tentative steps.
He took tentative steps. He kind of did it, but it took him a while.
Yeah.
But by this time in his life,
Now he's just,
to do something, he doesn't.
and you're going to see that reinforced, that idea where Abraham, you're seeing the progression of his faith, where now he's sold out. And you'll see this reinforced in the next chapter too. There's things, it's kind of interesting how it's like he's bought in completely at this point. So we can surmise and wonder about what did Abraham actually think, but what we see is, let's just use God's own assessment. See what God says about it. And this is what God declares to him at this very moment. And I call it the promise being tied to obedience. This is God speaking to Abraham. By myself I have sworn. Remember how the covenant worked, where God couldn't swear by anybody greater. So he swears by himself. Because you have done this. Key point there. Because you have done it. Done what? Went all the way to the end, was ready to sacrifice Isaac as I asked you to. And have not withheld your son, your only son, there's that phrase again. I will surely bless you, because I will bless you. And I will surely multiply your offspring. Here's that promise again. He just reiterates the promise. And as the sand that's on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And then there's that sandwich at the end. Because you have obeyed my voice. God's making a point here. Obedience is integral to blessing. God didn't just pick Abraham and say, Abraham, do whatever you want. Now they're starting to see, no, Abraham, remember when the covenant came in, now there's an official agreement between God and Abraham. And now there's responsibilities for both. And so you see it really evidenced here where this was not a test for God. God knew what Abraham would do. This was a test for us to see now. Years later, when all the arguments started up over the law and everything else, God wanted this written down as evidence. For by grace you are saved through faith, not by works. With the Baptist mantra. I can just sit here on my blessed assurance because I'm saved. Well, we know what James thinks of that. You know, you're dead if that's what you do. And we see it all the way back from the beginning. God does require obedience.
You know, it's interesting. I never connected because you've done this and have obeyed my voice. Obeying is better than sacrifice.
Yep.
And that comes back to what God told Samuel told Saul,
Yep.
the first king of Israel.
Yeah.
Whenever he disobeyed God as king, and that's what took the entire blessing of the kingship away from him, was he decided to sacrifice as opposed to obey.
Right. And Jesus, you know, his condemnation. Well, go back a little farther. That goes to the prophets. And their condemnation of the nation was always about, they brought that up again. You know, God would come through the prophets and say, I'm sick of all your sacrifices. I'm sick to death of your sacrifices. They're a stench to me. What does he want instead? Obedience, trust. You know, and so, yeah, I mean, this is from the beginning here. I mean, you can go back to Adam and say, you know, Adam just didn't trust. You know, it's always a lack of trust that causes, and James talks about it. We're drawn away. Drawn away from what? Our secure position. We're drawn away from it by our own lusts, our own. And so that's not a New Testament thing. That's not a new thing. It's all through all of Scripture. So yeah, I like and when, again, the neat literary thing that's done here with this paragraph. It starts off with it, and it ends with it. That's a point of emphasis. And so the blessing, the promise, is now tied to obedience. Always has been, but now it's made much clearer, which is just natural. I mean, why? It's not like, it's a Western idea where we separate faith and works and trust and obedience, and in the Hebrew mind, and it's the same thing. It's all one thing. You know, faith and the works associated with faith. Why would faith not do works? Well, what are the works of faith? Trust. What does that mean? It means you trust. Sometimes it requires this, sometimes that, sometimes this. Whatever trust requires, you do. You know, and that's where we get messed up, because we want a formula. But for any given moment, it can be different for you and for me and from, you know, but it's all trust. I have to trust him in my life, and what I'm dealing with and going on with and all the stuff that comes up against me may be different than the stuff you're dealing with, but it's the same trust that God expects and the same obedience. So anyway, I'm sorry, get a little preachy there. But I just think it's really neat. Anything else about just this sacrifice and what was going on? Oh, yeah, actually that one is. That's a good observation. There is a new element here, is what she's pointing out. I'm saying this for the sake of the people listening. I've been told I need to remember to do that because they can't hear you. And so, yeah, she was pointing out that there's a new element here about, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. This is going to be repeated later on. And it's also, I think, cited, or it's alluded to. Jesus alludes to it as well. But yeah, that is a new element. It kind of fits with the, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. That's part of the original. So it kind of fits with that.
And also, could you see it with the possessing the gates of his enemies? Do you think Jesus is drawing upon this in John, where he says the gates of hell will not, because those were,
I think so.
gates are defensive mechanisms.
Yeah, it's yeah, the
Saying this offspring will destroy the strongholds that.
yeah, because that's the corruption, that's the, sin, death, hell, all that is bound up. It's powerless against the redemptive act of Christ. So I think it is. I mean, you'd have to work out the details, but it's a very valid. Anybody else got any? Yeah, and I'm not saying it's always that way, because sometimes it just means to see. But here, just the way it's combined, I think it's trying to draw that.
But we do that in our vernacular too, in seeing to something.
Yeah. Because we can use the word produce. I can produce something. You can't see it, but I'll produce it from behind my back. Now you can see it. You know, that kind of idea too. I didn't make it. There's lots of overlap with words is what I'm, but.
How old would have Isaac been around this time?
I see. Doesn't, let's see. Well, we know it was after his age of weaning, which in that culture, I'm not exactly certain what that age would have been. But he was old enough to pack the wood, you know, because it talks about he put it on him, so how much wood did he take first. So I would say from youth to teenage, somewhere in that. I've heard people argue that, well, he was probably big enough to fight, because they tried to put, well, he was submissive to this. It doesn't say, you know.
Well, there is some sort of like submissive element because he did have questions. He was old enough to
Right.
observe, but also it doesn't say anything about him fighting. He was also willing.
Right. It does seem to indicate that he was with this, whatever was going on. We don't know what Abraham. Yeah.
In the New Testament parallel, he's probably 33 the age of Jesus.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd go that far but I mean, yeah, we're not given a lot of the timeline.
There's something about Abraham and Sarah and their parenting
Yeah.
to teach him about the Lord.
Yeah, and we'll see this with the servant here later on too, that there's obviously some instruction going on, because you can't pick up all of this just from osmosis, you know. So yeah, and again, that's the unwritten part that would be neat if we had more, you know, information about just how did Abraham relay all of this that he was picking up, and so this chapter, so 21, 22, chapter 23, sad chapter. Sarah dies eventually. You know, she's 127 years old, so she was 90. So now Isaac would have been 30, in his 30s. Again, it doesn't tell us the exact, it just tells us her age. She dies. And the chapter is kind of interesting, and it gives you all kinds of details, but it's tempting to say, well, I don't know what's going on here. What's the big deal about Abraham purchasing some ground to bury his wife at? But again, remember where this is situated. Yes, it's historical. This is when she died, and this is when it happened. But Moses writing all of these things down, there's lots of other things he may have been able to include that he didn't. So why did he include this? And anybody have family burial plots, you know, where you have a lot of family members? Do they still do that a lot? You know, you'll drive by cemeteries and they'll have a family name on it. That's how it started, as a family's cemetery. There's a tie to the land in a burial ground. This was the old home place, or this was our ancestral home. Where is Abraham's ancestral home? Mesopotamia, far away. So this is significant that Abraham, this is the first and only instance we have of Abraham purchasing, legally buying property in Canaan that he has a legal claim to, and that his descendants will have a legal claim to. This is burial plot, and I think that's why this is put here. It's not just so they could mark a shrine. There's a theological significance of this account. And so, again, I tried to find what theologically does this show us. And what struck me was, the first thing was Abraham's humility. And so I just have a series of verses from this chapter, because we have Abraham meeting with the Hittites. They're the ones who lived in the land where he was sojourning in southern Canaan. And so he came to the Hittites, and he's requesting to purchase some ground to bury his wife. That's the context. And so there's this conversation back and forth between Abraham and the Hittites. And so I've picked out certain verses, and I just highlighted in red what to me seemed like, Abraham, remember, he was the one that gathered up all of his servants and kicked the tails of 5 different city kings. He could have just taken it, but he didn't. Look at his attitude. I am a sojourner and a foreigner. That's how he's recognizing who he is. This is not my land. I don't have anything that I can just demand, but this is my request. And in this bowing to the Hittites, that's not just a cultural thing. Standing up and bowing is a significant form of showing deference to another person in this culture. So he does that several times. He also says, I'm going to pay full price. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm not asking for a deal. Whatever you say it's worth, I'll pay it. So to me, these were just very humble attitudes. And then he bows again in verse 12. And again, reiterates, I will pay the full price. Now, in context, I'll flip to the next one and then you'll see the back and forth. The next one is Abraham's esteem, how he was esteemed by the people. Remember, God said, I will give you a great name. We're starting to see that because the Hittites' response to him is, you are a prince of God among us. So they respected him a great deal. They may not have followed the same God as he did, but they saw he was blessed by this God. And they recognized that. And their response is, just pick. Just choose. Choose a spot. We'll give it to you. You could take whatever you want. But Abraham refuses. And they keep on. No, take whatever you want. He says, no, I want to pay for it. And they're like, okay, fine. And he says, well, he already had picked out a spot. So there's this guy named Ephron. He says, go to Ephron. He has a cave at the end of his field. I don't even want his field. I just want the cave so I can use it as a burial cave. And they're like, oh, that's fine. So they go to Ephron. Ephron's like, just take it. Take it, the field, take the whole thing. It's yours. And they were like, no. But you see this, they greatly respected him, but he didn't take advantage of that. That's the odd thing that I caught out of this back and forth thing. So he purchases this cave and the whole field. And the significance to me is is Abraham buying in. He's like, because he could have took Sarah back to his family, because his family and her family were the same family. Remember, this is way back right after Babel. They did that. It wasn't bad. She was his half-sister. So when he would tell people, she's my sister, he wasn't lying. Not really. And he could have went back, took her back, and buried her in her homeland. But no, he's tying himself to this new land, Canaan, that God has promised to him and his ancestors. And he even says it this way, that this land has been promised to my offspring. He doesn't say explicitly, therefore I'm going to buy this chunk and start here. But this shows that he's bought in. Saying, yeah, I'm going to bury her here. This is the burial plot. We'll start with that. And just the significance of being close to the dead ancestors. Being close to where they were buried was significant in the culture, so that his son, Isaac, would be close to it, and his grandsons and all of his offspring after him would be close to this area. And it tied them to the land, to this particular region. Yes.
That wasn't taken by force, it wasn't charity, like David purchased the threshing floor. Christ's sacrifices, we were bought with a price.
Yeah.
There's no disputed ownership.
That's a good point, that by buying the field and emphasizing in this account that he bought the field, if it was just a gift, they could renege on that gift. Well, he didn't really own it. He didn't really have any say over it. We skipped over it, but there was an earlier thing about a well that they had this thing with one guy about a legal agreement about a well. But no, Abraham making it legal. This was the legal way of doing things back then. All this detail that they show demonstrates that this was a legal transaction. Because then it talks about he weighed out the silver according to the merchant's weights. So the account is very clear to say, and that's good. So no one could then question. I mean, we're arguing over that today in Israel. Who owns Israel? Palestinians or Israel? And it's like, oh, just if you'd use this book instead of ignoring this book, you'd have some more evidence for your arguments. But anyway.
Jacob in Egypt wanted to be taken back.
Yeah, and Jacob wanted to be taken back. Yes. That's the land. Take my bones, and Joseph was when you go back, take my bones with you, and Jacob too. Make sure they took his. That's made a special trip, but Joseph was very clear when he died. Make sure when you leave that you take my bones with you. So it was just a very significant. We're not quite that bad now. I don't really care. Just throw me in a box and just don't let whatever. But right. Yeah, it's a connection. Yeah, it's a connect. We maintain a little bit of connection to the land. Yeah.
Crazy question here. Is there some significance in the fact that the burying place was bought from the Hittites? Because this is the first time outside of Genesis 10 and Table of Nations where the Hittites are mentioned.
Yeah, I was reading, talking about the Hittites. There's several, well, not several, but there's more than one group of people referred to as the Hittites that they've discussed. They're not sure if this is the same group that was mentioned earlier, is why I'm getting at.
And here's kind of where the weird part of my brain is going. Is if you go to Ezekiel 16, God says to Jerusalem, your origin and birth are in the land of Canaan, your father an Amorite, and your mother a Hittite. Is there some connection to this first mention of the Hittites as being where Sarah is buried? And him saying, Jerusalem, your mother is a Hittite, and your father an Amorite.
I would have to, just off the cuff, I would say no, not necessarily. Not that there's not anything, but probably not. Only because of not knowing, are they referring to the same group? They've just only relatively recently figured out the big Hittite empire that was up in Turkey, southern Turkey. That's obviously not this group, although there may have been some connection at some point, but they don't know. So I would be hesitant to say definitively, but it is a curiosity. It's something that you could check.
Filtering through, and if you see the Hittites mentioned predominantly in the death and burial place here,
Right.
in Bathsheba, from the Messiah came, and then this other spot in Ezekiel where God's
Yeah,
showing Jerusalem of their Hittite mother.
And you got to add the weird factor just because it's Ezekiel. I thought you looked like you were. I didn't see the elbow, so I figured you were free to. No, I'm sorry. Just being ornery. Got to pick on you when I can. So the last chapter, and you bear with me. This one's not. I won't say it's not important, but there's lots of details that just repeat itself. And so I didn't have a lot here, other than why go back and get a wife from the land where he came from? Why not just get a wife for Isaac from the Canaanites? Yeah, probably, maybe. Different gods. Yeah. I don't have I'm just curious as to what you guys have thought about, if you've ever thought about that. Because there is you see later on with Esau and Jacob, this, you come back to this because Rebekah, which that's Isaac's wife, Rebekah, Jacob's and Esau's mother, Esau just goes and gets wives from the locals. And it talks about how that basically chafed his parents. So there was some disapproval of that. And then Jacob, Rebekah is very clear about, go back to my brother. Go back to him. And partly it was because of his own safety, get him away from Esau. But also the idea was, don't take wives from the people close by. And it mentions Ishmael, that Hagar got him a wife from Egypt. And it's just kind of like and so there probably is an association with the gods that they were with.
Could there be something to it that God had already promised to give the land of the surrounding nations to him? And that if he would have married within the people group that would be dispossessed, the thought that why do I want to be married why do I want my blood to become that of that which is going to be dispossessed?
Did you have a...
Could it be like I mean, I don't know, but maybe he's seen some abnormalities in the people.
Yeah, I mean, we've got Sodom, and it wasn't just Sodom.
Right, but I mean,
There was a...
maybe there was
Yeah.
some,
It's like,
I
I don't... yeah, that's a mom speaking right there. Like, no, not... Yeah, and I think there's something to the idea of the local gods. Now, Laban and those guys, we'll find out later on that they weren't, I mean, they knew of God, but they weren't all that loyal. And so, but Abraham came out of that, and there's just this thing of, go back, I don't want to take a son from here for my son. Well, anyway, I just wanted to see what you guys had...
Well, it's kind of been like that. I mean, just within the last 50, 60 years,
yeah, we tend to, yeah.
mingling as far as different nationalities.
Yeah, and it wasn't that far after Babel either. Common language.
I know in my family,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know, you were a white American, you married him.
Yeah.
That's just the way it was,
We tend to,
70 years ago, and then they
yeah. And there, before there was a lot more, the religion was more associated with the ethnicity than there is now too. And so you had that aspect of keeping within a religious group too. It's interesting to think about. And it is a pattern that you see. And later on, the Canaanites were just associated with being vile, evil, beyond the norm, apparently. And so, again, I think there's some validity to Abraham. He's wandered all through the land like, nope, we don't want any of this. We'll go back to where I came from, or at least they know what God's name is, that kind of thing. But I wanted to point one thing out here that I talked about earlier about Abraham tying himself to the land. Notice what he tells his servant. The context of this, he goes to his servant, his head servant, and he gives him the task of going back to where he came from and finding a wife. And he tells him, the angel of the Lord will guide you. And he makes him swear to do this a certain way. He said, if you can't find the woman, or if you find the woman and she doesn't want to come back, you're freed from your obligation to me. But two times he says this, do not take my son back there. And the reason the context of this is the servant says, well, what if I go and I find the woman that you're talking about, but she doesn't want to come back? Do you want me to bring Isaac to them? And Abraham is he's like, no, he stays here. And then he stays in the land. If he goes there, he may not come back. And he says this twice, do not take my son back there. And Isaac, of all of them, Isaac's the only one that never leaves Canaan. Abraham goes back and forth. Jacob goes back and forth. Isaac stays. Isaac's actually forbidden God, there's some case later on we'll see next week where God forbids him. Don't go here. Stay here. And it's like slowly he's locking on to, this is home. And then the other thing I saw in this one was the servant. This is the most extensive conversation we have written down from somebody who wasn't one of the patriarchs. It's Abraham's servant, and he's praying to God, and he's asking God, please help me to do this, and here's how I want it to work, so I'll know for sure I'm finding the right. He's very faithful to Abraham, wants to find the right lady, has no idea. He's being sent off on his own sojourn. He doesn't know where they're at, who they are, anything. I'm just going to go. But God meets him and meets every criteria that he sets out. And then that's what my verses I have here. And then he's worshiping God, saying, oh, it happened just like I asked. This is awesome. I know you're God. Before he's talking about his master's God, the God of my master. And so one of you mentioned about the influence that Abraham was having on people in his household. And here's another example, I think, of when you just see this servant who's been with Abraham through this whole thing, listening. Servants heard everything. They knew everything. And he's absorbed the right thing, of who this God is and how this God works. And I just think that's a neat. And then real quick, the last thing is Rebecca. She's kind of overlooked. But imagine some dude comes up. You're just going to the well like you do every day. This dude asks you for a drink of water, and you're okay, fine. And all of a sudden, he's loading you up with jewelry. Whose daughter are you? And you rattle off whose daughter you are, and he loads you all up. And I've come to get you as a wife for my master's son. Like, see you, dude. You're a nut. I'm out of here. Again, this is different culture, different world, but it's just amazing how she's almost like a female version of Abraham in a way. She's also being called out of her home family to marry a guy she's never even met. Yeah. They wore nose rings. Yeah, they were. No, it's just, it was, other than, there may have been some significance to it, but no, it's like, yeah. She must have had a place for it, I guess. I don't know. Yeah.
Another interesting thing you see, somebody said earlier, it's what you sometimes don't see in the text that speaks a lot more. Because if you go back, whenever Abraham sacrificed Isaac, and after that ordeal it says, and Abraham went down, and with the servants, and then they went. Isaac's not mentioned there. In fact, Isaac is not mentioned in the text. The one who is the allegory of Christ until he meets his bride who's never seen him, who's introduced by a servant whose name means peace, who gives a deposit of all this jewelry and a promise that you're going to go someplace to some guy you've never met and be united in a promised land and be an heir to this great promise. So you begin to see this parallel of what Christ in the church is at, even through what is
Another.
subtle thread that runs through this, because Isaac does not appear in person until he is joined with his wife.
Rebecca's given agency as well.
Yeah.
I've had the argument several times with a few different girls who are like, oh, women are just chattel in the Bible. Well, Abraham instructed his servant.
Yeah.
Rebecca can say no. She doesn't want
Well, and that's a good.
and the servant would have been freed from his oath if Rebecca said no. It wasn't Rebecca's father or grandfather or mother saying no. Rebecca can say no.
And I'll have a.
We have free agency to choose to go and marry. And that plays in too, that we have free agency as the bride of Christ. We have the choice to reject Christ.
Yeah, and that's a good point of that Rebecca did have. Originally her brother and her dad kind of speak forward and say, yeah, fine, take her. We know Abraham. He's a rich dude. This is awesome. But later, and that's why I put this one up, which goes with what you were saying, She had agency because they wanted to keep her there. We'll see this later with Laban and Jacob. They were a weird group of people. But anyway, he said, well, the servant would say, hey, if she's going, let's go. Let's get out of here. I got to get back to, and they're like, oh, hang around for a while, maybe 10 days. And he's like, no, we got to go now. And then they say, well, let's ask Rebecca. Maybe banking on, well, she ain't going to want to leave right away. And so they bring her in, and they called Rebecca and said to her, will you go? Only words we hear from her until later on is, I will go. That's where I see the parallel with Abraham. You know, that, yeah, she could have said no, and that would have been the end of that deal, you know. Been like today, how, the guy's rich, why'd you say no? Anyway. But that is another type that you don't see a lot of is between Isaac and Christ as the bride of the church, which I said there's lots of, you know, we don't have to limit our examination of Scripture to the types that are pointed out to us by the apostles. Because I think we are allowed, as long as we play by the rules, when we see those connections, we don't force them, we don't make them up, but when we see the natural connections, we'll see a lot more. Joseph's never mentioned by any of the apostles, and there's all sorts of analogies you can pull from Joseph. Why did they never bring it up? Maybe God's like, no, leave that up to everybody else. They'll find it. You know, I've heard people say, oh no, we can't do that because it's not in Scripture. Sure it is. Half of Genesis is about Joseph. So, you know, anyway. Sorry for the little delay there. Any other, real quick, any other? The only thing about going through this so much material, it'd go kind of fast, but any other thoughts while I don't remember what the next chunk of chapters is. I didn't write it down. Does anybody have my? Yeah, it's probably at least 4 or 5. So just read the next 4 or 5 chapters. You'll be. We'll get into Isaac. We're going to get into Esau and Jacob. So it's going to get weird again. Yeah. This was like the nice, pretty straightforward section. By weird, I mean culturally weird. There's going to be some odd things that we'll have to unpack a little just so we know what's going on and don't get weirded out by it. Yeah. Beans, lentils, awesome. Yuck. But anyway, hope you guys have a good